Hi, my name is Sashiran Vaidyanathan and welcome to the CI/CD tutorial video. In the first section, let's build a sample integration where we will make a REST API call, extract the response and push it to a PubSub topic. The first step is to create a PubSub topic. Next, let's create a PubSub connection. In the GCP console, let's go to the connections, create a new connection, select the region you want to deploy this connection to, select PubSub from the list, provide a connection name, let's call it PubSub, provide the project ID, grant the permissions, provide your topic ID that you want to point out to, provide the number of nodes if applicable, then let's click next and then create. Please note that this may take up to 15 to 25 minutes to set up. Once the connection is active, let's go back and create the integration. Now in your GCP console, let's go to application integration and click create integration. Give it a name, let's call it sample, a sample description, and let's click create. Once the integration is created, you will be navigated to the integration studio. Now let's create some input, output and config variables. For this integration, we will require some config variables. So the first one is a URL. Let's select config variable in the variable type. Next, let's create the second config variable called con_name for the connection name, and let's create. Lastly, we'll create another config variable for the topic name. Now let's create a new input variable called user. Make sure that you select input in the variable type dropdown. And now let's click create. Finally, we create an output variable called user output and make sure that you select output from integration in the variable type. Let's click create. Now let's create the integration task. Let's drag and drop the API trigger. Next, let's add the REST task to the flow. Once you click the REST task on the right config panel, let's update the endpoint URL to use the config variable that we created earlier. Next, let's add query string parameters with query string key being user and the value with the variable we created user. Next, let's create a connector task and configure the connector to use the connection that we had configured earlier. Let's rename the task to publish message. Click the configure connector, select your region, and you should see the connection that we created from earlier called PubSub. Select the type as actions and the entities as publish message. Click done. This should automatically create a connection pointing to the connector that we had created earlier. Once this is established, you should see two variables automatically populated called connector input payload and connector output payload, which we will be now using the data mapper task. Let's update the config variable to use the config con_name variable that we had created earlier. Now let's add the data mapper task to the integration and then let's connect all the tasks together. Once that is done, let's click the cleanup graph to clean up the overall visual representation of the integration that we've created so far. Next, let's work on the data mapper task. Click the data mapping task and click open data mapper editor. In this particular editor, let's configure the response body as the input and the connector input payload.message as the output. In the second row, let's drag and drop the config variable conf topic as the input and connector input payload.topic as the output. Finally, we need to extract the information from the response body. So we will have to convert the response body to a JSON using the toJSON function and then add additional functions called getProperty, which will look for args as the property name, and then again use a get property to fetch the user entity within the args. Now let's drag and drop the user output variable to the output column on the right. Now that we've configured this, let's click the back button and we are done with the data mapping task. Now let's go ahead and publish this sample. Let's click publish, provide all the necessary config variable values, and let's click publish integration. Once the integration is published, let's go ahead and click test. Let's provide the user input value John and let's click test. Once the integration is succeeded, you will see the user output also presented here called John. Now let's make some changes. Now let's click enable editing and go ahead to the variable section on the left. Select connector output variable and select output from integration in the variable type dropdown and let's click save. Similar to that variable, let's do the same thing for the response body variable as well. Let's click save. Now let's go ahead and publish, provide the config variable information, publish integration, and now let's click test. Provide a username again and let's click test integration. Now you will see that response body and the connector output payload variables are also shown in the execution result. Now we know that everything worked. Let's go ahead and now start creating test cases. So the first step is to create unit test. Now let's enable editing again. Under test cases, let's select create a new test case. Let's give it a name. Provide a description and let's click create. Now this should open it in test case mode. Now let's click the API trigger and furnish a user input value. Now let's create REST task and enable some mock options. For this particular task, let's provide the response header mock value, response body mock value, and a mock value for the response status. Let's click add assertion and make sure that the assertion is set to success. Similar to REST task, let's click the data mapping task and add assertion to that as well. Let's select asset conditions in this case and provide the following condition. Finally, let's add another assertion to make sure that the execution was successful. Finally, let's add an assertion for the publish message connector task to make sure that the asset execution was successful. Now let's click exit test case mode. Let's publish this integration, provide all the necessary information and publish integration again. Go back to the test case and select the test case that we've created. Now in here, let's click the test. Now this should trigger the test cases that was created as part of this test case. Now we can see that all the test was executed and we can go to the view log section to see the actual execution with the mock values that we had actually provided as part of the test case. With this, we can execute test cases with a mock strategy that will help you do some unit testing to your integration. Now let's exit this test case mode and start working on the integration test. Now let's enable editing on the integration. Similar to unit test that we created earlier, let's go ahead and create a new test case for our integration test. So let's give it a name, a description, then let's click create. Once we click create, it again opens it in the test case mode. Let's go ahead and provide the input variable for the API trigger. In the assertion, let's make sure that we are asserting that everything is pointing to a value that we expect from the calls that we make to the provided URL. So in this case, we are looking for the response status and looking for 200 OK specifically. Then let's also make sure that the data mapper task is checking if the user input and the user output that was extracted from the response body are matching. Finally, we also make sure that the publish message that we are making a call to the pub sub topic is returning a message ID and the output from that call is not null. Now that we've configured the test case, let's go ahead and execute it. Now let's click test and run test. This shows that the test execution passed. We can go ahead and see the logs. The logs basically shows the actual call being made to the endpoint, extracting the response body, and it matches the input variable that we had passed. With that, we are done with the test cases as well. Next, we will discuss automation in a separate video. Hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.